Look at the red shield on your computer. You trusted Mcafee antivirus to protect your digital life, believing it was the ultimate guardian of American cybersecurity. But the man who wrote that code was not a savior. He was a paranoid warlord who snorted synthetic drugs while building a heavily armed private jungle militia to hide a bloody reality. Wall Street media and the Silicon Valley greed machine actively covered up his sadness to keep the stock price soaring, transforming a volatile addict into a tech messiah. John Mcafee sold absolute safety to the Pentagon while his own unblinking eyes constantly scanned the shadows, driven by a paralyzing terror that invisible enemies were always watching. He weaponized your anxiety to build a billion-dollar empire, only to end up dead in a squalid Spanish prison cell with a mysterious assassination tattoo on his arm. How did a fugitive manipulate the global financial system and convince millions to worship him? In exactly 20 minutes, we will dissect the exact psychological blueprint of his delusion and reveal the terrifying open secret he took to his grave. 1989. The fluorescent glow of cathode ray tube monitors lit up suburban living rooms and trading floors across the United States. America was hypnotized by the pristine utopia of the personal computer. People typed their deepest secrets blindly into the void, completely convinced that the digital frontier was a pure sanctuary untouched by human corruption. They trusted the machine. Then the glowing screens began to flicker. Malicious code mutated in the dark. Floppy disks clicked frantically inside plastic drives as the Michelangelo virus gnawed through raw data. Corporate accountants watched helplessly as their pristine ledgers dissolved into chaotic gibberish. Middle-class families saw their digital archives vanish into dead black pixels. The invisible bleeding had begun and nobody knew how to stop the hemorrhage. Decades before this digital plague, a young John Mcafee sat at a stained kitchen table. His fingers twitched, a bizarre physical tic he would never outgrow, as he meticulously aligned a row of dominoes. His father, a volatile alcoholic who would soon end his own life with a gunshot, backhanded the boy across the face. The man leaned over the shattered dominoes, reeking of cheap liquor, and spat a sentence that would permanently wire his son's brain. You are nothing but a fragile little target. So in this world, you either terrify them or they slaughter you. John stared up from the cold linoleum floor. His eyes remained wide and unblinking. Slowly, the corner of his mouth curled into a cold, practiced smirk. That moment of absolute powerlessness forged his ultimate psychological fatal flaw, a paralyzing, perpetual terror of being defenseless. To survive, John constructed an impenetrable public mask. He would present himself as a benevolent, eccentric genius of Silicon Valley, while concealing the ruthless, paranoid predator underneath. The digital contagion soon spread upward. The Pentagon realized their defense grids were completely naked. Wall Street executives saw their unencrypted financial empires exposed to the void. The American elite stared at the terrifying possibility of instantaneous systemic collapse. The apex predators of capitalism were suddenly prey, and the realization made them desperate. They did not want a traditional hero. The ruling class needed a dictator ruthless enough to build a digital fortress and lock everyone else outside. They needed an architect who understood the anatomy of terror. John Mcafee, compulsively chewing the inside of his cheek until he tasted copper, was waiting in the shadows. He knew exactly how to monetize their panic. But the most terrifying question echoing through the sterile server rooms was never about how he stopped the initial virus. The core unsolved mystery was what sinister backdoor he quietly embedded deep within the architecture of his antivirus empire. A sleeping threat waiting to execute its final command. John Mcafee did not invent the concept of cybersecurity. He invented the commercialization of digital terror. When the Michelangelo virus was first detected in a few isolated academic networks, most software engineers saw a minor technical glitch. Mcafee saw a psychological weapon. He understood that the American public was fundamentally illiterate when it came to the digital world. They feared what they could not see. He stepped into the spotlight wearing the perfect public mask of a benevolent, eccentric genius. He wore comfortable sweaters and spoke with a calm, paternal authority, projecting the image of a selfless protector. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, his unblinking eyes scanned the television studio with the cold calculation of a predator. He recognized that the ruling class was terrified of losing their newly digitized wealth. He did not simply offer them a software program. He offered them the illusion of absolute control over an uncontrollable environment. His fingers twitched rhythmically against his leg, a bizarre physical quirk that only manifested when he was about to initiate a mass manipulation. He went on national television and projected that millions of computers would be completely destroyed, numbers he fabricated out of thin air to maximize hysteria. He weaponized the media infrastructure to broadcast his virus of panic. The public did not buy his software because it was technically superior. They bought it because he made them feel like they were bleeding and he held the only bandage. But how do you convert localized panic into a permanent multi-billion-dollar global empire? The answer requires fundamentally rewriting the rules of human trust. The first step in his domino effect of absolute control was crushing the market with brute financial and psychological force. He needed a megaphone large enough to infect the entire American consciousness. During a closed-door meeting at a major broadcasting network, an executive producer pushed back against the apocalyptic narrative. The producer slid the script across the table and shook his head. "We cannot broadcast these casualty numbers, John. They are completely unverified by independent researchers, and airing this will cause an unjustified national panic that we will be held liable for." The room went dead silent. Mcafee did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply stopped moving. His jaw clenched tight, the muscles twitching violently under his skin as his dark, unblinking eyes locked onto the producer. For 20 agonizing seconds, Mcafee just stared, letting the heavy, suffocating silence crush the air out of the room. He leaned in slowly until his face was inches away from the executive. "You can kill the story right now," Mcafee whispered with an icy, lifeless tone. "But when the global financial grid collapses on Monday morning and 50 million American bank accounts are permanently erased, my first phone call will be to the New York Times to provide them with the documented proof that you knew the slaughter was coming and intentionally chose to let them burn." The producer swallowed hard and approved the broadcast. The resulting panic was unprecedented. Imagine you are standing in a crowded, windowless theater. Someone secretly barricades all the exit doors from the outside and then casually drops a single lit match onto the dry carpet. As the smoke rises and the crowd begins to scream, that same person taps you on the shoulder and offers you the only fire extinguisher in the building. But the price is your life savings. That is the exact macroeconomic mechanism Mcafee engineered. He manufactured the smoke, locked the doors, and sold the extinguisher. The cash flowed in like a tsunami. Retail investors and massive institutions blindly threw their capital at his company, desperate to buy their way out of the anxiety he had deliberately injected into their veins. He took the company public and amassed a staggering fortune, but securing the money was only the preliminary phase of his grand design. To truly insulate himself from his paralyzing fear of vulnerability, he had to weaponize the law and build a physical fortress behind the reach of traditional authority. And to do that, he had to disappear into the heart of darkness. Step 2 of his master plan involved liquidating his corporate identity to establish an untraceable sovereign dictatorship. Mcafee sold his shares, cashed out hundreds of millions of dollars, and vanished from Silicon Valley. He relocated to the dense, lawless jungles of Belize, a developing nation where extreme wealth could literally buy the legislative branch. His deep-seated psychological flaw, the blinding terror of being helpless, consumed his reality. He was convinced that the United States government, corporate rivals, and invisible assassins were actively hunting him. To counteract this relentless internal dread, his public mask morphed from the eccentric tech pioneer into a heavily armed, untouchable messiah. He weaponized the systemic poverty of the local government. He did not just bribe police officers. He systematically purchased the entire local infrastructure. He donated millions in equipment to the police force, effectively transforming the National Law Enforcement Agency into his own private security detail. He built an impenetrable compound surrounded by high walls, vicious guard dogs, and mercenaries carrying assault rifles. His physical quirks became more pronounced. He would sit in his jungle compound for days, sweating profusely, eyes darting at every shadow, his fingers constantly tapping the grip of a loaded pistol. He was manipulating the psychological landscape of an entire nation, creating a microstate where his paranoia was the only governing law. He threw lavish, drug-fueled parties, surrounding himself with vulnerable young women, feeding his narcissistic need for absolute dominance to silence the screaming vulnerability in his head. He had successfully isolated himself from the legal reach of the American empire, but the fortress he built was a psychological prison. The more power he hoarded, the more intense his paranoia became. The local population grew terrified of the unhinged billionaire who operated above the law. He had cornered the physical market of power in his region, but his intellect demanded a much wider hunting ground. How does a disgraced exiled warlord trapped in a Central American jungle manage to reach back into the United States and extract hundreds of millions of dollars from a new generation of victims without ever stepping foot on American soil? The mechanism he deployed next would prove to be his most ruthless masterpiece. Step 3 required locking down a new global monopoly. Not on software, but on greed. By the time the cryptocurrency boom erupted, Mcafee recognized a familiar psychological landscape. It was the exact same environment as the early internet. It was a lawless, unregulated frontier filled with incredibly naive people desperate for wealth and terrified of missing out. He smoothly reapplied his public mask, rebranding himself to a new generation as the ultimate anti-establishment oracle. He weaponized their greed just as effectively as he had weaponized their fear decades earlier. He charged massive syndicates over $100,000 for a single promotional message on his social media platforms. He would identify a worthless digital asset, purchase massive quantities of it in secret, and then broadcast a fabricated, highly technical analysis predicting its inevitable rise. His unblinking eyes stared through the camera lens in his videos, projecting supreme confidence while his jaw muscles twitched with suppressed adrenaline. He triggered massive buying frenzies. Retail investors, blinded by the illusion of overnight riches, poured their life savings into the assets. The moment the price peaked, Mcafee and his associates liquidated their holdings, crashing the market and leaving millions of normal people financially devastated. He had built a decentralized cartel. He operated outside the jurisdiction of the Securities of Exchange Commission, floating on a heavily armed yacht in international waters, mocking the very authorities that tried to contain him. He had locked his monopoly on human psychological manipulation. He proved that you do not need to create a valuable product to siphon billions of dollars from the global economy. You only need to identify a collective insecurity, amplify it into a blinding panic, and then position yourself as a sole arbiter of truth. His architectural design for absolute control was flawless in its execution, generating unimaginable wealth and unassailable power. Yet, despite successfully conquering the digital and financial worlds, the paralyzing terror inside his mind never subsided. He spent every waking second waiting for the invisible executioner. And as we dig deeper into the final chapter of his empire, the most chilling question remains entirely unanswered. What was the ultimate devastating fail-safe code that he embedded into the global network before he was finally captured? The sleeping secret that terrified the intelligence community enough to potentially silence him forever. At his peak, John Mcafee controlled the security infrastructure of over 500 million devices globally. During his exile, he orchestrated cryptocurrency manipulations that violently shifted over $13 million in retail wealth in a single afternoon. You might look at his drug-fueled spirals, his chaotic flight from authorities, and conclude he was merely a wealthy lunatic who stumbled into historic wealth through sheer luck. You might think his empire was an accident of a madman. That naive assumption is exactly what he depended on. Pure insanity is disorganized. His financial slaughter was mathematically precise. Every public meltdown and every violent twitch of his jaw while he stared unblinkingly into a webcam was a calculated deployment of his chaotic public mask. Driven by his paralyzing internal terror of being defenseless, he meticulously engineered environments where everyone else was the victim. He did not get lucky. He manufactured the crisis and sold the cure. Yet the ultimate irony of his existence breaks every law of morality. A fugitive who armed cartels, evaded taxes, and ruthlessly exploited the financial anxiety of a generation was not condemned as a parasite. When his lifeless body was discovered in a Spanish prison cell, an entire subculture immediately canonized him. They worshipped a paranoid dictator as a libertarian martyr and a pioneer of freedom. The architect of their panic became their messiah, but his blind disciples failed to notice the final mechanism he activated. The most terrifying mystery is not whether he actually hanged himself, but what catastrophic digital payload he linked to a dead man's switch before his pulse stopped. An apocalyptic secret he promised would detonate the moment he was gone. The brutal reality is that the global economy is engineered by paranoid predators like Mcafee. They hide their paralyzing terror of being defenseless behind benevolent public masks, using unblinking stares and twitching jaws to manipulate the masses. As long as you remain blind to their psychological warfare, you will always be their perfect prey. The elite will continue to drain your wealth while you willingly worship their lies. The only way to survive this rigged system and uncover the catastrophic dead man switch secrets they buried is to study their exact behavioral blueprints. You must learn to recognize the invisible architecture of control before the next tech dictator locks you inside a new digital cage. Subscribe to this channel now. We decode the ultimate psychological weapons of the ruling class so you stop being the victim and finally see the trap.